Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Donnelly Bell, and I'm delighted to be joining my colleague Sareena Hopkins on this presentation. We are from the Canadian Career Development Foundation, and so we want to walk you through a bit of a cycle of a journey of a program that we have been working on for the last 8 years. But before we get started, just want to say that Serena and I want to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. We thank all Indigenous people worldwide for their stewardship of the land and pay respects to their culture, their elders past and present and emerging. So if I could walk you back to 2012, CCDF was working on a paper called Transitioning Graduates to Work, Improving Labor Market Success with Poorly Integrated New Entrants, specifically looking in Canada. You see the acronym PINES there, and that actually comes from the OECD because in 2012, there was a lot of concern about a growing difficulty that youth were having in transition, and it was extending to youth that had diplomas, had degrees. So they weren't the traditional youth that were of concern. And so the federal government reached out to the Canadian Career Development Foundation to explore what this meant for Canadian youth. And in that paper, we focused on interventions that can support school to work transition. And it looked at categories of programming that were effective across interventions, postgraduate interventions, so reactive interventions, demand side interventions, and those interventions that were specific to underrepresented groups. In the conclusion of this paper, we made a recommendation that if you have limited resources, where you want to put the bulk of your resources, acknowledging that resourcing every interventions across all of these four categories are important. But if you have limited dollars, it seemed to us through our research that early interventions, those preventative, proactive interventions, were the biggest bang for your buck, if I can describe it that way. And so you would think that having that piece of research that the Canadian Career Development Foundation would focus on programming at early interventions. And just the way of things and the way of the world, we've actually spent 8 years working on that reactive strategy, interventions that come after someone has struggled to gain a foothold in the labor market. And it's called In Motion and Momentum. But wait for the conclusion because Serena's going to circle back at how we're coming back to an early preventative approach. So, just to give you a little bit of the backstory of why we've been focused for the last 8 years on this, in Canada, and we also know elsewhere that there's been a growing challenge over the last few decades in publicly funded career guidance provision. Despite significant and increasing and complex barriers faced by those struggling to enter or struggling to maintain labor market participation, the career and employment, specifically the public career and employment ecosystem, has continued to operate with the same unproven approach. Get people into any job as quickly as possible and hope that it sticks. And this approach has created a bit of a spin cycle, at least specifically in Canada. So a client walks through the door of public employment services. They are not consistently or rigorously addressed for their employability issues. Clients get referred prematurely to training and employment. They fail due to unresolved systemic and pre employment issues. Employers and training providers get increasingly frustrated by the inappropriate referral and costly turnovers. The clients return to services because they still have those needs, but they're feeling now less hopeful and further away from sustainable labor market attachment, and the cycle continues. So, what we found is that much of the system is ignoring programming within that supports the development of social and emotional learning, or as we've been describing them, those employability and influencers that you see on this slide. So things like self-esteem, confidence, hope, connection, mattering, belonging, goal setting, knowing yourself, self awareness, all of those things that we know now from research that support career development. And without them, progression can be difficult. So we wanted to create a program that filled this missing piece that we were seeing in the ecosystem. Before designing the program, we had an opportunity to review about 300 national and international programs that target specifically intra and interpersonal skill development. And we found a common underpinning. Many of the programs, many of them excellent programs, approached the skill development from a conceptual frame. Many had
I think there is a little bit of interruption in the connection. So Sareena, can you probably continue?
We'll jump in until poor Donnelly unfreezes. Luckily for her, she wasn't frozen in a terrible facial expression, as it so often happens. So yes, Donnelly was saying that we were asked by one of our regional governments to create a program that would address exactly the issues she was just describing, to get at some of those foundational underpinning sort of readiness issues around what's going on inside of the person, their sense of hope and motivation and resilience, as well as what is going on in terms of their support network around them. And I'm just going to keep talking, hoping that Donnelly can join and bring up her slides again. Otherwise,
I'll bring up the
just
slides,
pause.
Sareena. I'll bring up the slides.
Okay, thanks so much, Allison. And so what we found was that many of the programs sort of always seem to start with, let's talk about the definition of self-esteem and what are the factors that help with motivation. And it's very clear that people don't lack self-esteem because they don't understand the concept, right? And so we were very keen to explore a very different approach that was all about creating experiences in people's lives that allowed them to reconnect with the strengths that they already had. Because believe you me, if you live in poverty and survive, you have a lot of strengths. And so to reconnect with those and reconnect with their sense of purpose and what matters to them. And so rather than being forced quickly into a job, any job, to actually figure out what was going to be a meaningful goal for my next step, and begin to build towards something more impactful. So this, in a nutshell, is the program. It is highly strengths-based, highly experiential. There's 3 elements to it. The first is 3 days a week for 3 weeks. And it's really focused on just what I was describing, reconnecting with your sense of self, your sense of strength, and what matters to you. Rebuilding structure in people's lives. Often when you are living in poverty, there aren't a lot of elements of structure in your life, and so daily habits. The second part of the program is around giving back to community, which may sound a bit counterintuitive, and yet the resilience research is very clear that when people can move from a sense of feeling like they are just a burden on society to actually having a contribution to make, that's a turning point in people's lives, and it is a protective factor around resilience. And so participants come together and create a community project that fulfills a need in the community. And then finally, the last piece is quite tailored and focused on really building toward the transition of achieving whatever it is, the goal that they set for themselves. So we can move to the next slide. I'll go quickly through some of the results. We've been blessed to have 4 rounds of research on this project. The first has been actually going on with annual evaluations since 2016 in one of the regions of Canada where it's delivered province-wide. So it's delivered very widely across an entire region. And there, among one of the most exciting results is that province, that region went from the highest levels of social assistance costs. So the government provides social assistance to people living in poverty, and their costs on that front were the highest historical levels they had ever been in 2016 when we started this program. And quite quickly, they moved to the lowest historical levels. Was more than a 10% reduction, which is millions and millions of dollars in that region of cost savings. The second research phase was a small pilot in another region where findings were replicated. So increased self-esteem, happiness, interpersonal functioning, improved daily habits, better social supports, optimism, motivation, increased career goal clarity, which certainly relates to the research that Anthony and crew have been doing, the capacity to overcome barriers, and mental health. The third study, which was a much bigger study right across Canada, 6 different provinces, 27 sites in very diverse settings with very diverse populations, absolutely replicated the results, highlighting increases in emotional intelligence, again, self-esteem, resilience, motivation. We used the employment hope scale in this study, and we saw statistically significant increases, particularly among those that are most distant from the labor market. So persons with disabilities, those that identified as BIPOC and youth. And then the final is a very rare bird in our field. We were able to participate in a randomized controlled trial. That is still underway. But we do have interim results. It's across 5 provinces, 14 delivery sites. And here we are seeing a replication of the previous results, but also some really exciting results around impacts on pursuing further education, training, and employment among, again, those most distant from the labor market. We can go to the next slide. And this slide just really summarizes very much what I've highlighted in the previous one, breaking cycles of dependence on social assistance, increasing employability for those that are furthest from the labor market, increased goal clarity and the capacity to overcome barriers, hope, and optimism, significant improvements in psychosocial health, including elements, factors of mental health, career management skills. People love the program and feel that it's useful and are recommending it to their peers. And what was really exciting for us, we're seeing, we've delivered this with Indigenous-led organizations, with organizations that work with persons with disabilities, with BIPOC groups. So very, very diverse populations. And we're seeing that with very minor adaptations, it is really holding those same results. And we can move to the next slide. And this is where I'm going to bring it back to full circle. Donnelly talked about the importance of preventative interventions. And even though we were not mandated when we were engaged to create this program, we were not mandated to create it as a preventative program, but as it has been delivered, every facilitator and so many participants say to us, we so wish this could have been delivered earlier for people. They see the potential for this to be really impactful at an earlier age as a proactive, preventative measure. We have been able to have the program granted high school course equivalency in 3 of our provinces. So we're very excited about the prospect of being able to explore the efficacy of the program as an actual in-school intervention to re-engage those youth who have disengaged, either who have dropped out, to re-engage them back and get them back on track, or for those who have just disengaged mentally, are still in school but have really disengaged from believing in a sense of future for themselves. And so we hope that that's something that we can explore further in the future. If anyone's interested in learning more, or maybe exploring how we might do that together, I'm very keen to talk. So with that, I'll say thank you so much.